Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, former state representative from southern Minnesota, and we are joined, as usual, by Walter Hudson, a state representative from Albertville. Walter, it's been a few weeks since we've done a podcast. I know I got busy. We both went on vacation and Easter, and then you've just been inundated by legislative sessions to watch the Democrats just cram through omnibus bill after omnibus bill, and to their credit, individual single subject bills that just erode liberty, spend money, and quite honestly are destroying our state bit by bit. And I'm thankful that you've had some time on a day off today to cut a podcast to go through some pretty important legislation. And I want to start this episode we can't get into every single bill the Democrats have crammed through. Obviously, there just isn't much good that's come out of this legislative session. But I have to stand back, and I don't mean to give them compliments on what they've done, but there is an overall strategy that they have laid out to advance their agenda in order to pass legislation that you can't criticize, because when you're in the legislative, when you're on the debate on the floor, you can only speak to the bill at hand. You can't talk about other legislation that ties to this, but it's all part of a plan. When they passed the abortion bill, you knew they were bills that were going to pass, that were going to expand what that bill was going to do, but you couldn't talk about it in the debate. Right. So there's an enormous strategy at play. Same thing we've seen with the transgender bills and the sanctuary bill that passed, and then the language that you guys caught kind of at the last minute, which would have basically protected pedophiles. Right. I mean, just it's amazing the strategy that they have implemented. And of course, their connections with the media, being able to promote things as advancement of civil liberties, and instead it's eroding parental rights and everything else. But can you just speak to, I mean, you don't have to disclose what you've been in meetings with on the GOP side, but is there discussion about their overall strategy to get this through and what the path is to undo some of these things, if there is a path, in the next 2, 4, 6 years?
Well, look, I mean, you say you don't want to pay him a compliment, but I think that there's a difference between providing moral sanction for something and admiring the effectiveness and the audacity and the potency of the execution of a plan. So, for instance, when we watch The Godfather, we're hopefully not providing moral sanction and approval of the actions and activities that are being portrayed, but certainly there's widespread admiration for the character of Don Corleone and the character of Michael Corleone, and how artfully and maniacally they accomplish their goals and defeat their enemies. And in that sense, yeah, there's a lot to admire with the DFL. There's a lot to admire with the Democrats. They've been very Machiavellian, and they are thinking strategically at a high level about, as you say, how to advance their agenda. And that really is a differential between us and them, certainly in this state. Some would argue nationally. But certainly in this state, the difference between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, even in the culture, even outside of politics, even in the culture, I think, is that they have a appreciation for power and its utility. And they are committed to obtaining power and then using it. In fact, I forget exactly who it was who tweeted it out. Might have been Ken Martin. I think it was Ken Martin, the chair of the Democrat Farmer Labor Party, bragging about the fact that they are using their power in order to accomplish their agenda. Not even trying to water it down, not even trying to soften it, just explicitly saying, we are using the power that we have. And it's important to recognize that power was not obtained with an overwhelming popular mandate. I mean, they barely won in a number of races, including statewide. I have colleagues in the House Republican caucus who won their race by as little as 15 votes. Um, and there are analogs of that on the other side, right? So nobody can claim that the case that they were making to the public for the most radical and extreme version of their ideological offer was something that was widely embraced. And yet, that is precisely what we have gotten in terms of legislative outcomes and bills and proposals. They're pedal to the metal, full crazy on their most insane proposals, and they're passing them unapologetically and spiking the football. And so I think there's a lot to learn from that for our side, for Republicans, for conservatives, both in terms of the political reality of what this game is about. And it is a game, unfortunately, a war, whatever analogy you want to use. It's a battle. And that battle is scored by votes. And if you have more votes than the other side, you will win. And if you don't, you will lose. And it doesn't matter what your arguments are, doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, doesn't matter what's just or unjust. All that matters is the power. They understand that. That is what is fueling their agenda. And our side needs to wake up to that fact and get on board with obtaining that power so we can do some good.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you've come to the realization that on the House floor, it doesn't matter what arguments you make. It doesn't matter how in the middle you try to portray yourself, but you're never going to convince people, at least in the Minnesota House of Representatives, to change their vote from when they came in there based on what they've been told in caucus of how they're supposed to vote. It just doesn't change. In fact, so many bills have passed, even in the Senate, right on a party line vote where the Democrats have a 1-seat majority. And we had some Democrat senators taking to social media claiming that they're moderates. Well, they're not, because everything passes on a party line vote. Now, they had to do probably an enormous amount of arm twisting in caucus and on the floor to get them to vote in that manner, but probably in caucus, since bills don't come to the floor unless they know they have the votes to pass. Yesterday on the House floor, you had bipartisan opposition to the Paid Family Leave Act. You had 2 Democrats cross over and vote with Republicans, but Democrats still had the 68 votes they needed to pass it, which is what you need. And so they, in caucus or beforehand, allowed those 2 members to flip their votes and to oppose it to win re-election the next time. And I know that Republicans have offered a slew of amendments to bills, and some of them are substantial to actually improve the bill. Most are typically just political gotcha moments or additional campaign mailings that you can make based on a vote. But and of course, every one of those goes down, or the Democrats amend the amendment to neutralize it so that the amendment itself is withdrawn. But there's just so many things that have passed this year that are altering. I mean, in itself would be an enormous story, but because there's dozens of these bills, it gets watered down in the media, and people are like, it's just another one. And if Republicans had taken the trifecta last year, and we had a Governor Scott Jensen and a majority in the House and Senate, I don't think you would see even 10% of the fight in Republicans. I don't think that they would be advancing even a fraction of the conservative agenda is what we've seen the Democrats do. And I mean, we saw this when Republicans are in the minority. They don't even try to advance stuff because they don't have the majority, even though when Democrats had the minority or were not in control of the trifecta, they would pass, radical legislation in the body that they controlled, knowing it was going to be stopped because they don't care. They want to show the Democrats and show their base that they're fighting. And, I don't know. I don't know where Republicans are going to grow a spine if we do take back the control of things. We saw this in DC, of course, when Trump had both the House and Senate and failed to repeal Obamacare, which everybody campaigned on.
Yeah, and as a first-term member, I don't know how that's going to play out either. And hopefully we get the opportunity to demonstrate whether we have a spine or not by getting in the majority. That's yet to be seen. But let's skip ahead and say it happens, right? So it's 2025 and it's a new biennium. with Republicans in control of the House. The institutional issue there is that we're still going to have a Democrat-controlled Senate, albeit with a one-member majority. So there's some leverage there potentially to get some stuff through. And we're also going to be dealing with Tim Walz, who's just god awful. I mean, he is a true believer in all this garbage. He's not just like a political utilitarian. He is that, but in his heart and soul, he believes all this nonsense. And there's nothing too radical for him to sign. And also nothing too reasonable for him to oppose. So we would be proceeding under a circumstance where we would have to acknowledge that any truly good idea is never actually going to become law. But to your point, you do still have to cast your vision and show people how it is that you would govern and what you think the proper policies for the state ought to be. For me, the question is, how would it sort out once you got to this point in the process? So once you get towards the end of session where bills are coming together and deals need to be made, conference committees are happening, and you're in these end of session negotiations, because I've never experienced that. You have, of having divided control of the legislature and an oppositional governor. How do you resolve things in such a way that the state of Minnesota has a government, right? Like that it actually, you have an end of session without selling out or losing your soul or however you want to characterize it. I don't know, because I've never seen that dynamic play out in the front lines the way you have. But I imagine that the stronger you are at the outset in terms of putting your flag in the ground and saying, this is what we're about and what we stand for, this is what we're passing, then in other words, the more aggressive your opening negotiating position, then the better the final outcome will be, even if you have to negotiate back to the middle.
Right. And we've talked about this during a divided session when we did the podcast, 2 years ago, where the opening position for the Republicans in the Senate, that when they had the majority 2 years ago, was we're going to grow government by 5%. And Governor Walz wanted to raise it by 15%. And so then the end of session negotiation basically increased government by 10%. And this is when we had, 1% inflation. My argument at the time was Republicans should be cutting government by 10%. If Walz wants to grow it by 10%, maybe we could negotiate and just holding the line at not growing government at all, which should be the conservative position, by, keeping it the same or shrinking it. And where do you negotiate when you already start halfway down the field? Or if the Democrats want to raise government by 5%, they're going to ask for 10% and try to meet in the middle and get everything they want. It's a tough situation. 2 years from now, if the Republicans take control of the Minnesota House, you will have something that looks very much like Congress does today, where Republicans took control of the House, Democrats have a very thin majority in the Senate, and the White House is occupied by a Democrat. So the first half of the session, you're going to have the Republicans passing great legislation, conservative, taking victory laps, talking about how we did this and we solved this and we've done this. And half the American public thinks it's law. They think what McCarthy's doing out there is actually law, or hey, great job, guys. But everything is dead on arrival in the Senate, and nothing is going to get done from a conservative agenda. But then at the end of the session, there'll be negotiations and compromises that Republicans will quietly agree to. You have the opportunity to vote no on the bonding bill as it leaves the House, but you can vote yes on the conference committee report when it comes back. And so you vote against it and then you vote for it, and you can go to your constituents, your conservative constituents, and say, I voted against that bill, but then you voted for the bill in compromise. And that's in a divided legislature. If it's the entire Democrat legislature, you guys don't have a voice now. You're not being included in the conference committees when the House and Senate passed different legislation, because they didn't need you when they passed it. they certainly don't need you to help negotiate differences between Democrats. So I know that people are making stink about it in the media, but this should be where Republicans don't cry about not being involved. They should just say they're not asking for our help to even write legislation. They're not asking for our votes to pass it. They're cramming everything through, claiming that they have a directive from the voters that this is one Minnesota when it's not one Minnesota. They're just absolutely cramming through metro legislation to try to change everything for their benefit, and they're hurting rural Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and it's a really difficult thing to communicate, right? The fact that 2022 was a inflection point. That was the opportunity to give one side or the other a trifecta and therefore determine the overall trajectory of the state. That decision was made, regardless of, we can criticize the integrity of the process, but power's going to power, and power resolved into the Democrats having control of the state. They've got it, period. And that has a lasting impact. We win next year. All we're doing, in effect, is slowing them down. We can act as a speed bump, but we're not going to be able to reverse anything. Not with them in control of the Senate, and certainly not with Governor Walz as governor. Let me shut this down so you don't get that again. You're certainly not going to get it with Walz in the governor's office. And so expectations need to be set, I think, amongst our side of what it is, what the mission is, and how we aim to achieve it. Ultimately, we need to and I hate using this phrase, but it's true. We do need to take back all three legs of the stool, ultimately, in order to really push our agenda in the way we want to do so. But what that doesn't mean, and I think the reason why people often scoff at that language is they see it often rightfully as an excuse for not doing the things, for not at least trying to do the things that we know need to be done. I would suggest, and I've had no conversations with anybody you ask about, what's the strategy long term, that those aren't the focuses of the conversations that I'm having with people right now. We're focused on what's going on in the legislature, the legislation that's before us. But if I was in a room with people having that conversation of what's the long-term strategy and how should we be approaching this, I would say we catch the car and we get the majority in 2024. We should be doing exactly what you prescribe. We should be passing bills that dramatically cut the scope of the state. And I've provided the framework to do that with one of my bills that we've talked about before, which is the limitation of the state budget to 5 1/3% of personal income. We can figure out that number, and then we can write a budget. We can work within a budget that matches that number and say, this is what we're doing, and kind of model it and be like, this is what government would look like if we actually implemented this. And do that as a precursor to, once we take back the Senate, being able to put that question on the ballot for Minnesotans of like, hey, do you want your government to actually be sustainable? Do you want there to actually be some limitation on how much money the state can tax from you and spend? And I think the overwhelming answer to that question would be yes. But we shouldn't be afraid to model it in legislation beforehand and say, hey, here's what we're willing to do. And the upside of doing that is that if we present to the Senate and to the governor a budget that has been cut in dramatic fashion and takes care, and by the way, takes care of the priorities, right? So we're going to do what we need to do in education. We're going to do what we need to do in public safety. We're going to do what we need for nursing homes and things that people care about. But all this extraneous garbage, the bureaucracy, the administrative state, the things that we don't need, we're going to get rid of. Then you're presented with a negotiating scenario where you have to come up with something between that and where they're at, where they're at, we know where they're going to be. They're going to be constantly pushing for more, persistently pushing for more taxes, more spending, a bigger budget. And so if you really want to, if you're going way too fast and you're about to hit the car in front of you, you slam on the brakes, right? You don't pitter patter around. And so that's what I'm talking about is we need to slam on the brakes with the hope that the tension between our proposal and their proposal results in something that's not god awful.
One of the keys to advancing the conservative agenda, or actually negotiating decent compromise in a divided government, is the Republicans' control of the purse if they take back the Minnesota House. No budget bills can pass without the House agreeing to that. How on earth the Republicans in control of the House and Senate, when I first came into the office, grew government by double digits is just beyond me. It's baffling. But this idea of shutting government down because the governor is unwilling to compromise, kind of like what we're seeing in the federal government, where McCarthy's asking for some piddly, cuts over 10 years while still growing government each year. And the Biden administration still won't even negotiate, and at risk of shutting down government agencies because the funding would be cut. Why can't the legislative, if Republicans take control of the House and say, look, this is our budget, this is what we're going to pass, 5% mandatory cuts across the board, or you're not getting anything done. And Walz would have to just basically accept shutting the government down unless he negotiates. That's something the Republicans have never had the spine to do, to actually explain to the Minnesotan voters, look, we need to make these important cuts or we're not going to be able to function. And somehow the Democrats will always be able to blame Republicans, but Republicans can't blame the governor for not negotiating.
Yeah, well, the difficulty there is that there's only one governor, and there's 134, 136 of us, whatever the number is. And so our message always gets dispersed and diluted, whereas his message always gets echoed verbatim. And that's true regardless of the party balance, right? So if it was reversed and it was a Democrat House and taking on a Republican governor, the governor would always have the same advantage. Now, is that a reason to not do it? No, we should do that. We should be willing to go to the mattresses, so to speak. But there's ways to mitigate that too, right? So another idea I have that I haven't pursued and should introduce a bill to this effect. And there might actually be a bill like this. I'll have to look into it. But I think we ought to get rid of this whole shutdown brinksmanship. I don't think it's good for the state. I don't think it's a sustainable governmental practice. I think it makes for terrible politics that it is not serving the people of Minnesota. And so what I would like to see is a provision which, ideally constitutionally, eventually get this as part of the Minnesota Constitution, where if we can't come to an agreement between the legislature and the governor as to what the budget ought to be in the next biennium, then fine. Everything gets funded at its current level minus, I don't know, 1%, 2%, 5%, whatever, some number. And, even if you ended up with something modest like a 1% across the board cut, year over year, session over session, that's going to ratchet up the pressure on everyone concerned to actually get something done, because you're going to be working under. It's kind of be like that scene in Temple of Doom where the walls are closing in on them, right? And the spikes are popping out. Like that pressure to do something, to figure a way out, is going to continue to ratchet up, and that's going to make life more difficult on politicians without dramatically adversely affecting people out here in Minnesota, in the state. That's the way it ought to be. And so I think, obviously something like that isn't going to get passed with just having the House, but you have that bill and you champion it and you put it out there and you say, this is the way things ought to be. And every time that the governor rattles his saber and talks about how terrible it's going to be if government shuts down, you point to that bill and you say, well, this is our solution to that. This is not the way things ought to be. We're interested in being serious. We're interested in having sustainable stewardship in the state of Minnesota. And if future governors, if this governor or future governors aren't willing to act responsibly, then we ought to have a provision in law that allows the state of Minnesota to move forward um, and puts a continuing pressure on the politicians to get their job done, as opposed to punishing the people because they refuse to.
Yeah. I want to jump into some legislation. Uh, the first bill, I had some conversations with people about the catalytic converter theft bill. I think is it House File 30?
Man, that feels like it's 10 years ago. I can't remember. Like, that's going way back.
Well, it's interesting because this bill. So obviously, catalytic converter thefts have been an issue in the state. I mean, same with car thefts. And how do you lower theft? Do you make it more illegal? Do you fund police departments to go do stuff? This response was we're gonna make felons out of uh, the small business owners that are buying these recycling companies. And I was surprised at how many Republicans, including yourself, voted for the bill, because I know it's like it's one of those campaign mailer issues, right? Where it looks good, kind of like when we had a meth crisis, and the legislature basically made it the ingredients more illegal and put them behind the counter, the methamphetamines, and kind of ran on a campaign on saying, "Hey, I solved the meth problem, and it's just gotten worse." Um, do you remember this bill? I mean, it basically it requires that recyclers have to keep paperwork on everybody that brought in pieces. It actually used a 2003 law that was passed by the legislature to address all the copper theft. Remember when
Yeah.
people were breaking into houses and stealing copper, and then they put the onus on the copper recyclers to record and keep paperwork on everybody that was bringing in copper for recycling, and made it a gross misdemeanor if they didn't. And this is, I think it raises the fine to felonies if you get caught with 3 catalytic converters that don't have proper paperwork, as a way to stop thieves, which this isn't going to stop thieves. Thieves don't care about small business owners being, criminalized. But this seems like this is the Democrats' way forward, is to cast blame on the other people, not the thieves.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've taken a look at the language of the bill, so I can't give a comprehensive analysis of it. But off the top of my head, I think this is an example of trying to keep the perfect from being the enemy of the good. If I recall, because this was a standalone bill, if I recall,
Yep.
that was passed off the floor, there were amendments, or at least one amendment, addressing that concern of, why are we going after people who aren't committing the crime, right? And trying to adjust that. And obviously, like every other amendment we put forward, it was voted down. And so there was definitely recognition and conversation of, this is not the perfect approach. This is not the right approach, but it's certainly better than doing nothing. And this is an ongoing problem that you gotta provide some kind of response to and mechanism for addressing the and again, I would have to look at the language to do a real comprehensive analysis and tell you exactly what I was thinking when I pushed green. But suffice it to say, when all things were considered, I felt that the good outweighed the bad.
Yeah. Well, it's tough. I mean, there was a lot of bills that I saw come to the floor where it sounds great. It has a great title, and it's great to be able to tell your constituents you're doing something about it. I just, so many times government causes a problem. Like, government created this problem because the EPA had these like restrictions for the environment that caused the car manufacturers to have to create this stupid particulate filter for scrubbing the exhaust, and they used precious metals in doing it. And of course, it's outside the vehicle because it's exhaust, and people figured out they can steal it in 5 minutes, and now you've got a $5,000 item that's worth sometimes more than the car. It's crazy. Another bill that I'd like to criticize the legislature, and this is small. I mean, first of all, single subject bills, I'm thankful for that. They're not an omnibus bill, but this bill that has a great title, the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, sounds like you're helping homeless people. But then when you read about it, it's $50 million of taxpayer money given to people that aren't homeless, but are at risk of being homeless.
Right.
So, so they could have jobs and families in an apartment, and everybody's at risk of being homeless. In fact, small business owners and entrepreneurs are probably at higher risk of being homeless than people that have 9 to 5 jobs and rent an apartment instead of owning a house where a furnace can go out. But yet this money just shoves money into all these nonprofits that are sometimes very profitable for the people that run them. And there was only like 20 Republicans that voted against it in the Minnesota House. 21.
Yeah, I don't remember the particulars of that one either. It sounds like something I would have voted against. I don't recall what my vote was, but yeah, I mean, but that's the model, right? Like their whole deal is let's hand a bunch of money to nonprofits who are going to go around and put blankets around people's shoulders and hand them a brochure on recovery, and that's somehow going to solve the problem. Now, what I have discovered, or I'm in the process of discovering through actually going out into the field, into the community, and engaging with some of these groups, is that there is good work being done. It's a nonprofit doesn't equal bad, um, but there's just such a lack of accountability around it, right? And that's a complaint that I heard from the nonprofits is that they're like, because they're all in competition with one another for this grant money, and so they look askew at one another and are competing with one another and being like, this person doesn't deserve this money, we deserve it, right? And there's something inherently good in that. Competition is good, but at the same time, look, if this is a role, if we've identified, and my mind is drifting more towards public safety and the groups that are getting money from that, as opposed to the homelessness. But if we have identified a role that government properly ought to serve, okay, well then government ought to be serving that role. You don't outsource it, right? We don't hire roving gangs to police communities. We don't hire private companies to provide fire service. If this is something that we ought to be doing as government, then government, at the very least, people who are accountable to government, direct government oversight, and have to report on what they're doing and how they're spending money and what they're doing with their time, should be the ones who are actually on the ground engaged in the work. And instead, what we have is very often just large chunks of cash being rained down upon groups who say they're doing things. And the only degree to which we hold them accountable is by having them report back to the legislature with what basically amounts to a piece of paper that says, yeah, we're doing good stuff. We set out to meet our goals that we defined. I mean, very often in the bills that I've seen, it's reports where the criteria is determined by the person receiving the grant. So imagine, you send your kid to school and the teacher says, all right, Tommy, you tell me by what criteria I should grade you. And Tommy says, well, I guess if I eat 5 cookies today, I should get an A. And by the end of the day, lo and behold, he's eaten 5 cookies, so he gets an A. I mean, that's basically how our reporting structure works for a lot of these nonprofits. They get to decide what a win looks like, and then they report back, we won, amazing that. And so the whole thing is just garbage. So, there's the argument over whether or not something is the role of government. And then once you've decided yes or no, if you decide yes, then there's the argument of how best to administer and meet that role. And neither of those conversations are being well adjudicated under the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, and for those listening, I didn't tell Walter the things I was going to talk about. We rarely have any big discussion about what we're going to do in the show. We just jump right in. But I had a list of bills that just irked me, and I wanted to bring this up. And for Walter's benefit, he actually voted against this last bill we were discussing. He was one of the few that voted against it. But this next bill also deals with nonprofits. It's House File, is it 213, which is $5 million for food shelves, which on its face, great. It's a very small bill. It just says that it's going to appropriate $5 million to the Department of Human Services Commissioner to use for the food shelf program. It's great, but it says it has to be done in accordance with a specific statute, 256E.34 dealing with food shelves. And this statute actually names a specific company called Hunger Solutions that is in charge of distributing this food. Hunger Solutions used to have a board member last year named Erin May Quaid, who is now a senator, who was formerly a lobbyist for Hunger Solutions. She's the chief author in the Senate. The money goes right to that group. It doesn't have to be used for food. It could be used for paying administrative stuff. But it's, I understand that the food shelves are a means for government to help people that are having, to use the Democrats' word, food insecurity. But everybody's being hurt by the high cost of food. And we've saw all these food programs distribute hundreds of millions of dollars to nonprofits that like pillaged taxpayers and stole money, and to put more money into nonprofits that may be abusing this. It just was like, it's like it stings the taxpayers again to have this another $5 million thrown into the coffers, and to have a former lobbyist for this group carry the bill in the Senate just seemed really ugly. And they just got $9 million 2 years ago under COVID. And that bill specifically said that didn't have to be used for food, which just irked a lot of us in the House. But this bill passed unanimously in the House. There were 7 senators that voted against it in the Senate. There's a lot of just endless spending going on by the Democrats. And there doesn't seem to be, not to criticize Republicans, because I know you guys are fighting everything up there, but they're just, you watch some of the debate on these bills, and they're just, there isn't a fight or arguments brought up that would throw Democrats on that rare instance where they're actually going to reconsider or change the legislation, as what you guys did. And I have to give you great credit for it, on this bill that would have removed pedophiles from explicitly not being a protected class under sexual orientation. That was, it raised so many people's blood temperature or blood pressure when they saw that language actually out there. But you called them out on it, and they actually accepted an amendment to strip it out of the bill. So that was a good amendment and a good fight.
Yeah, and those opportunities, that's the thing, is part of this is just the fast and furious nature of how things go down. So for instance, that your revelation about Erin May Quaid and her connection to all of this, I'll just be honest, this is the first I'm hearing of that, right? So how do you, in the avalanche of legislation and the speed at which the process is happening, and the amount of pages in each bill and all of this, that's the type of thing that you're not going to discern by reading the bill, right? Like, the bill's not going to tell you, hey, by the way, Erin May Quaid is on the board of this organization that's administering these funds for a food shelf. So you have to be bringing that knowledge in from the outside. So there's definitely issues like that, and the majority has thrived on. I've said that some of the most impactful stuff that has been done this session is stuff that nobody asked for and nobody campaigned on, right? Like, nobody asked for increased vehicle tab fees. Nobody asked for a new delivery tax. Nobody asked to have taxes raised overall $9.5 billion. Nobody campaigned on that either. They didn't put it on their lit. They didn't knock on a door and ask somebody if that's what they want. They're just doing it. And so, a lot of these things that are discovered along the way in the process truly are legitimately discovered. And I think the language regarding pedophilia is one of those things where it was raised. From my perspective, because I was not on the committee or on any committee where that bill was heard, I learned about it like the day or the day before when it came to the House, that this language was in there and that there was going to be an amendment to address it. I believe it was carried by Harry Niska. And so, it's the old tired analogy of drinking from the fire hose. There's truth to that. You're not going to be able to catch it all. You're not going to be able to perceive all the sneaky little things that are being done. But every once in a while, you do get lucky and you catch something. Another example of that would be when I caught on very early in the process in Public Safety Committee to Representative Samantha Vang's effort to create a speech registry in order to document incidents of bias. That was very cleverly hidden. So we get these research summaries both from partisan and nonpartisan staff that tell us what's in the bill, and you read through it and you're like, okay. But then if you actually read the bills, and especially if you are coming at it with, as you've just demonstrated, some outside knowledge relevant to what the bill is addressing, then you can find these things that are implicit, but that the researcher isn't going to catch on to because they don't know, right? It just wasn't obvious. In this case, it was in the form of an author's amendment. So the research summary correctly says this is what the bill does, but then the author's amendment comes along and changes a word, and all of a sudden the changing of that word completely reshapes the character and nature of what the bill does. So in this case, she changed the word crime to the word incident as it relates to the development of a speech registry that's going to be held by the Department of Human Rights. Well, that completely changes the entire character and nature of the bill. Now you're no longer tracking crimes, which are things that have been reported to the police and documented and followed up on, and there's some objective due process there. Just incidents, just random things that, somebody perceived. And it was made very clear through committee and on the House floor this past week when we debated this, that literally anything that actually happened or that somebody just claims happened is going to qualify for documentation in this thing. So that's the sort of thing that if you're not paying attention to the details, if you're not reading the bills, and if you don't have all of the relevant external knowledge that's not in the bill itself, you can easily miss those things. And that's a big part of the problem. And I think it's extremely problematic if you actually buy into the narrative that the Democrats claim to believe, which is that democracy is sacred and the voice of the people matters, and it's oh so important that everyone have access and everyone have a say. Well, you can't tell me that you actually believe that if you're engaged in a process that intentionally or unintentionally obscures the reality of what you're doing from public scrutiny. And that's very frequently what we see in St. Paul.
Yeah, and that's just the first step during a hearing in a committee. When it gets to the floor, it passes the floor, could be amended on the floor. There's no updated, impact summary, and then it passes the Senate, and then it goes to conference committee. If a single word is different, it goes to conference committee, and during that conference committee, anything can be amended. You don't have to just work out the differences in the bill. I've seen Republicans and Democrats reach into their coat pocket and slip in handouts to their friends, changing the legislation. Representative Matt Dean is kind of famous for adding one repealer in the bill that, and repealers are, you have hundreds of pages of bill, and then there might be just like a one page of repealers. It'll say this statute section, this repealed, this section, whatever. That's the language of that isn't even in the bill. You have to go out and get your statute books from the back of the House chamber to actually read what is being stricken in that bill. And it could strike hundreds of pages of something, or it could strike just one word that could drastically change law. So you have to be up on reading those conference committee reports. And during that part of session, you are extremely tired because you're working 80 hours a week and you're, sleeping in your office, waiting to reconvene after other stuff's been negotiated. And then they give you a bill that you literally was posted 10 minutes ago, and you're trying to read through 1,000 pages to figure out what the impact is for your constituents. You just can't. If you're going to vote yes, I would say that you have to read the whole bill and actually understand what's changing. It gets really ugly at the end of session. And I don't know if I mentioned it on the show before, but somebody had called me about asking, well, this bill was assigned to committee. You see it online. It's assigned to this committee, but it hasn't moved. Is it dead? It's past deadlines? And I say, no. That means that the language can appear in the omnibus bill, or, and I explained what, that they pass these vehicle bills through committee and actually bring them to the House floor so that they meet all the constitutional requirements of what is necessary for a bill to pass. And then those basically blank pieces of legislation wait at the end, at the finish line. And then at the very last minute, the last day of the legislative session, they can amend thousands of pages of legislation onto that vehicle bill. And that bill then meets the constitutional scrutiny of becoming law. And so nothing is ever dead in the legislature until the legislature actually adjourns sine die, where they don't come back until the next session. So it's frightening that stuff can appear without scrutiny, but you'll see even more ugly acts of passing legislation as you get towards the end of session.
Yeah, and that is 100%, as you well know, an institutional reality that I've come to understand to my horror, which is that all of this all of this talk of deliberation and public testimony and listening to the people and all that, it's all garbage. The reality of it is the majority gets to do what the majority wants. The rules, we've had so many stupid rule fights. I just posted an example to Twitter today where I tried to bring an amendment to bring my three strikes bill into the public safety omnibus, and they ruled it not germane. It's not germane to address sentencing in the judiciary and public safety omnibus. It's so patently ridiculous and obviously political. But they can do it because they got the votes and they're in control. And similar to what you're describing, the ability to circumvent the constitutional process through parliamentary maneuvering and trickery, and to slip things into a conference committee, slip things in at the last minute. Um, it's all a dog and pony show. These people don't care about you. They don't care about what you think. They don't care about what's good for the state. They don't care about public input, public scrutiny. They only care about their ability to do what they want and pay back their friends.
Yeah.
And that's something that, in order for it to change, that I think at the end of the day, the only way you change that is by changing the character of the people who you send here. Because that's self-policing. Like, you're not going to be able to write a set of rules or pass a set of laws that force people to act honorably. Right? Like, you have to actually find honorable people and send them to do this job.
Yeah, and I've had conversations with legislators from other states about improving the single subject clause of our state's constitution, which requires every bill be a single subject. And I've worked with other states and who don't even have a single subject law, and they're like, yeah, we want to do this, and I'm like, well, we already have that in our state constitution, and the legislators still violate it. You have to be so specific and write legislation that would require them to follow it to the T, and that you need courts that are willing to enforce it. If the Republicans take control next year in the election of the Minnesota House, then you will also witness our own party doing the exact same thing to the Democrats that the Democrats are doing to us now. And that's, one of the nice things about Lisa Damuth being elected as minority leader is she gets to complain about stuff that she didn't do to Democrats when she was in the, when she was a majority leader or a speaker, because she wasn't, right. But it was, but to see those roles flip, the Republicans will do the same thing to the Democrats that they'll do stuff on the rules. I don't think they're going to advance legislation like the Democrats are doing now, but the rules get bent all the time. And there's so much of it's just theatrics. And I think it's really important that you just be consistent with the voters and tell them what's going on with the process. And, like what we do on the Omnibus podcast, where we explain the legislative process and all the rules and everything, it's been very helpful to a lot of people that have been tuning in to learn how things work and then how they can direct their energy and resources to try to enact change at the legislature by getting a little insight on how things work and when the best time to act is. That somebody contacted me about holding a rally. They want to hold a big rally for legislation. Maybe they would do it in June. And I'm like, the legislature's not even in session in June. If you want to get it done, it's got to happen in February or March, when the legislation still has a chance of becoming law. Even if you go up there today, we're past deadlines, to try to get something pushed. It's near impossible. So trying to find the right time and opportunity and how to apply that pressure to legislators it's really important.
Yeah, timing is important. Knowing the process, right? It's the same thing with like the BPOU and the party process and all of that, and increasingly with how loosey goosey our elections are just generally, having a deep knowledge of how it works, because it's not just showing up on election day anymore. It's registration all the time, early balloting, mail-in balloting, absentee ballots, all these things. The person with the knowledge is king. Like if you know how things get done, you're going to be able to affect your end better than the guy who doesn't.
Yeah. One of the things that looks like it's going to pass in the elections bill, or maybe it already did, they looked at expanding the percentage of votes you need to get in a statewide race to become a major party. They changed that. It sounds like they removed it and they replaced it with empowering the state party chair to approve who appears on the ballot with that party name. So currently, Tim Pawlenty just, when he filed to run for governor, he didn't even seek the endorsement. He just bypassed the entire endorsement process and just, paid the $100 or whatever, $500 to be on the ballot for governor as a Republican. And this new legislation would require the state party chair to approve any candidates that were going to appear on the ballot as a Republican. And that they would need to have at least, need to have received at least 30% of the delegate votes during an endorsing convention to appear on the ballot.
Yeah, that's the first I'm hearing of that. I would have to look at the particulars and analyze it a little bit, but it sounds not good.
No. Well, it empowers the state party chair. I mean, granted, there's a time and place for primaries, but if Pawlenty were to, if this passes into law, and Tim Pawlenty wanted to run for governor and bypass the endorsement process again, that he would have to have the state party chair's permission to be on the ballot, and so it allows the party to kind of control. Basically, the legislature is trying to prevent spoiler candidates. They're trying to prevent people from just paying $100 to be on the ballot as the Marijuana Now party, who has major party status or had, and spoiling the so a Republican could file as a third party to take away votes from the Democrat, and in this instance, then the party chair of that third party could say, no, they're not a real candidate for us, and we're not going to approve them to be on the ballot.
Yeah, I would have to look at the particulars to judge that, but anything that concentrates power to one person, I'm inherently skeptical of.
Yeah.
Especially something that limits the ability of people to make choices about who represents them. So I'll take a look at it, but my gut instinct is it's probably not a good proposal.
Yeah. Let's just jump in the last few minutes here. I wanted to talk about the U.S. race for president, the 2024 presidential elections already kicking off. There's one candidate in particular I find interesting to watch on social media, and that's Robert Kennedy Jr. He's running as a Democrat against Joe Biden. I would encourage people to go out and follow him on Twitter. He's got some really interesting posts, especially about the Federal Reserve and banking policy. And of course, he was an outspoken critic of the lockdowns during COVID, and of course on the efficacy of the vaccine. And he's always been for vaccine safety. But I'm sure his view on guns and the Second Amendment don't align with mine. But I think he's an interesting candidate to watch. And he's already polling at 20% against Joe Biden. So, and that's amazing for a Democrat challenging an incumbent. There's also a Republican that I think you made a post about, or you've been following. Who's this guy?
Vivek Ramaswamy is a candidate who's caught my attention. And I don't know all of his background, but he's apparently a successful businessman who's been running in political circles for some time. And all you have to do is listen to him talk for any length of time, and it's very clear that he's deeply knowledgeable of not just subject matter, but institutions and how they function and how they work. And he has a great analysis of our culture, and in particular, why we find ourselves in the political dynamic that we currently find ourselves, which is one where, as much of how we've talked about today on the show, the Democrats are very single-minded in terms of their overall goal, which is obtaining and using power in order to affect their agenda. And those of us on the right have this almost supernatural confusion about who we are and what we stand for and what we're trying to do and how to accomplish it. I mean, I find myself, I've been listening to a lot of Old Testament Bible passages lately, and I find myself attracted to the account of the Israelites in the wilderness when they first got to the promised land, which was actually relatively early on in their journey. They got to just outside the promised land, and they sent in the 12 spies to scope it out. And they came back, and the 10 spies had the bad report of, oh, these guys they're really tough and they're huge and they've got huge walls and so many resources, and there's no way we could possibly do this. And the cynicism was so offensive to God, who had promised, no, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to give it to you, that he basically just said, well, to paraphrase, to hell with you. Like, you guys can wander around for 40 years and all you people telling me that I can't do this after watching me split the Red Sea. You can die in the wilderness and I'll take your kids in the promised land. And that's the way it's going to be. I feel as though, and what he was doing there is he was like removing his protection, saying, I'm not going to fight for you. And in a sense, I kind of feel like that's where we're at as conservatives, where there's very little earthly explanation for why we're so bad at this. And what we need to come around. We basically need to recapture our faith in what it is that we believe and why we believe it. And that's what Vivek Ramaswamy speaks to, is he talks about the fact that we need to discover our identity. What is it that unites us? What is it that makes an American and distinguishes them from someone who's not an American? And he's not showing up. I mean, obviously he probably has, as I do, as you do, some nascent answer to that question. But he's not looking to, or at least it seems to me, that he's not looking to impose an answer to that question so much as to legitimately discover through this process of having this conversation in the context of a presidential campaign, discover what the answer to that question is. What makes an American an American? What makes a conservative a conservative? What does it mean to be a Republican? Why is it important? Why is it valuable? Why should people get on board with it? Why should they be excited? And through that process, kind of recapture our faith in the kind of manifest destiny, if you will, of not only why we must prevail, but why we will, why we should, why we're going to walk into that promised land and take what has been promised to us, what has been given to us, what we have the right to, what our birthright is. It's that type of moral conviction that I think is deeply lacking on our side. And it's really exciting to see a candidate like Vivek Ramaswamy make that case. Now, how far is he going to get in the process? I don't know. But I know that long term, answering those questions is more important than determining who the next nominee for president of the United States is going to be.
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to this primary season on the presidential side, because candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy and others will change the narrative of whoever ends up winning the primary. And hopefully some of their ideas and concerns will continue on the platform of whoever is the victor on that side. And, I think Donald Trump's coming into it with the majority of people supporting him. And we'll see if DeSantis enters or if he waits 4 years or what's going to happen. But it's going to be an interesting political season. And in Minnesota, we only have one statewide race happening in Minnesota, and that's the U.S. Senate race against Amy Klobuchar, who's many view as just a shoo-in in the next election. But whoever does run against her has an opportunity to unite Republicans on a message and to hopefully take back control of the Minnesota House and re-engage Republicans. And that message, you have to be for something. You can't just be against everything that Tim Walz and the Democrats cram through. You need to actually enlighten people and bring new people into the party for reasons that you need to lay out. And that's what's so important with finding someone who's going to be a good leader for the Republicans in this next election in our state. So we'll see who enters the race, and maybe it's probably going to be somebody from the Minnesota Senate, Republican, because then they have a safe seat. They get to keep their seat in the Senate while they run an uphill battle against Klobuchar. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, my mind has not even gone there in terms of contemplating who could run against Klobuchar, but I do hope that whoever it is, that it serves the function that you're talking about. Like we need a Vivek Ramaswamy type candidate who is asking the right questions and who's capable of tossing with people and going off script productively, like you say, uniting the party around a vision of what we're for. And I think determining, when you say what we're for as opposed to not just what we're against, it's okay to be against stuff. I'm against the trans refugee bill. I'm against House File 1, creating a space of anarchy around unborn life. There's all sorts of things the Democrats are doing that I'm against. But the reason why I'm against those things is because of what I'm for, right? Exactly. Like I'm for life. I'm for productivity. I'm for prosperity. And if you don't first outline what it is that you're for and why it's important, then people might not understand why it is that you're against the things that the other side do.
No, you're right. You need to connect the dots. There's so many of us that are deeply entrenched in politics forget to reel it back in and explain to people why they're frustrated that this is happening, but it's actually because of this policy that's caused it, and to connect the dots for people so that they can be a more informed voter and properly engaged in the political process. So it's great. All right. Well, thank you, Walter, for taking the time to cut another podcast. We'll dig into hopefully some more details on legislation next time we meet. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.